We continue with Derryl Maclean, and now we come on to the issue of the view regarding conversions, and this is really emphasizing voluntary conversions. Thomas W. Arnold, writing in Aligarh in 1896, was the first British historian who engaged with the coercive conversion argument, and according to him, the Arabs followed a policy of religious toleration in Sindh, which resulted in mainly voluntary conversions. Muslim historians have generally followed this view about voluntary conversion, and they focus on the methods of Arab conquest, but particularly emphasize the peaceful liberal policies of Muhammad bin al-Qasim, and contrast this with the policies of later Muslim invaders of India. Muhammad Habib, a Muslim Indian nationalist, compared at length the policies of Muhammad Qasim with the Turco-Afghans, reaching the conclusion that Qasim was truly Islamic, which is that he was liberal, generous, and tolerant of religions, while the latter were, that is the Turco-Afghans, were non-Islamic, illiberal, ignoble, and intolerant. Further, the Muslim historians then build the argument surrounding the reasons behind the conversions, because if they were not forced conversions, then the explanation had to be sought in other factors. They focus on this discussion on the nature of Islam, Hinduism, or Buddhism when they discuss this issue of conversions. So, Hashimi attributes the conversions to the attraction of Islam for the pre-Islamic people of Sindh, who were, according to him, savage and barbarians, and so Islam is seen as a civilizing influence. This view was recently also echoed by Ashik Durrani. According to him, Islam was also a blessing that, quote unquote, had this civilizing influence on the people. Just like the proponents of forced conversion theory, the proponents of voluntary conversion also do not support their arguments by extensive quoting from the contemporary primary sources. M.A. Ghani focused on the concept of brotherhood and equality in Islam as being attractive for lower caste Hindus, who then by converting were attempting to escape the inequalities of the caste system. Others emphasized the notions of justice and equality within Islam. However, there is no evidence for this either. In fact, a study of the Muslim institutions in Sindh shows that these institutions continued to legitimize caste inequalities. And I.H. Qureshi did a detailed analysis of the voluntary conversion hypothesis and speaks about the fundamental nature of Buddhism and Hinduism at the time of the conquests. And he suggests that Buddhism was making concessions to Hinduism since a long time, and it lost its moral stamina and power of resistance. So there were many conversions to Islam, leading to the disappearance of Buddhism. He maintained that Sindhi Buddhism was Mahayanist at the time of the Arab conquest, and it had begun to resemble Hinduism in its essential traits, and it had become corroded from within with Hindu beliefs and practices. So Buddhists became Hinduized and alienated from original belief system about which they became ignorant, and they were attracted to Islam by the religious toleration of the Arab Muslims. Again, Qureshi's view does not appear accurate on closer scrutiny because the Sindhi Buddhists belonged predominantly to the Theravada school of Samitya and not to the Mahayana. Thus, in both the views, one can see that at a methodological level, scholars misread, distort the evidence in pursuit of their convictions. So we find these kind of contradictory, which are seen as contradictory observations, that on the one hand, Muhammad Qasim forcibly circumcised Hindus of Derryl, and on the other hand, he forbade slaughter of cows out of respect for Hinduism. But none of these incidents can be located in the primary sources. The main issue also concerns terminology and method. Majority of the writings on conversion have not concerned themselves with defining these terms of reference. The term conversion itself developed in that Western Christian context, where it was used to describe two different sets of phenomena. One, it was taken as meaning a change in religious allegiance of an individual or a group from one system of belief or rituals to another. And secondly, it's also taken to mean a qualitative change in religious experience within a belief system. Mainly, we're dealing with the first meaning, that is the change in religious allegiance of individuals and or groups. Significantly, in definitions emerging from Christian context, it was understood that conversion meant a radical change in the root religious beliefs on the part of the convert or the convert group. A connected issue is also about what was the perception of Islam in the mind of the convert. And it's quite possible that the convert had a perception which was at considerable odds with the literate Arab Muslim definitions of textual Islam. It is also important to know what it means by forced conversion, which is taken to mean that a man or a woman is given the prospect of death, pain, imprisonment, which she or he can escape only if she agrees to the performance of acts of symbolic significance. Conversion should also be contrasted with Islamization. Islamization is used with reference to belief system of a convert and its movement to the belief system of some kind of a pan-Islamic textual Islam. So Islamization is then considered equivalent to Srinivasa's concept of Sanskritization, right? Which was simply a movement of the belief system of an individual or group from a little to a great tradition. So two levels of the conversion process can be separated. One is the initial conversion, which may have multiple views, even conflicting perceptions of what's really happening. And second is a subsequent Islamization, which has a more conformative dimension, something that would conform to that pan-Islamic textual Islam. Other terms which need to be also defined. One is adhesion and the other is syncretism. Syncretism means the fusion of two or more systems of belief or ritual to form a new, unified, harmonious system. It's not just an interpretation of systems, but a synthesis. Adhesion, on the other hand, means adding on another system of beliefs or rituals to an individual's previous system. The issue of conversion is compounded by the fact that the Arab and Persian sources are not concerned with the topic of conversion to Islam. Similar fact, Ira Lapidus noted for conversion to Islam in Egypt, where it remains an obscure subject and the Arab sources almost never comment on it. For since the chronicles are primarily interested in the initial Thaqafite conquest of Sindh. Thaqafis were this Arab tribe, okay? Like Muhammad bin Qasim belonged to that tribe, so therefore it's called Thaqafite conquest. So these chronicles are more interested in this initial conquest and not subsequent events, which is when one would expect the conversions to have taken place. There were two fundamentally different religions in Sindh, each with a distinct set of beliefs and rituals, class composition, and socio-economic basis when the Arabs came to Sindh. The members of these religions adopted a dissimilar stance towards the initial Arab conquest, and they were therefore affected diversely subsequent to the Arab settlements. To study this, Derryl Maclean also is influenced particularly by the idea of relative deprivation and reference group theory. These concepts are drawn from stress theory, and we'll see these as we proceed. Also, to fully understand conversions, Maclean analyzed the Arab policies towards the indigenous people in Sindh, and how these impacted the two separate religious communities in Sindh at that time. So, as far as the military policy of the Arabs was concerned, it's often thought to be inconsistent, having massacres at times and peaceful settlement at other times. The result of Arab policy was variable, but the policy itself, according to Maclean, was remarkably consistent throughout that initial concept. This policy has been vocalized in a letter of Al-Hajjaj, the Umayyad governor of Iraq, which was to be applied throughout Sindh. This letter stated, "Kill anyone belonging to the combatants, arrest their sons and daughters for hostages and imprison them. Whoever submits, grant them peace and settle their tribute." The Sindhis would have been aware of this policy. For example, at the time of the siege of the city of Brahmanabad, 4 of the leading merchants of the area met to review the situation, discussing that if they continued to fight, they would be killed, but if peace was made, then they would be saved from death, and the peace would be extended to the merchants, artisans, and agriculturalists. So they decide to surrender the fort. Sindhis at the time of conflict had the option. If they submitted, they received aman, which meant protection, or an ahad, which meant covenant, a contract. If they did not submit, they were attacked, and if they were defeated, they would be given the death penalty, and the families would also suffer a severe fate. So the Arab response to the area depended on if the city or region was taken by force or by treaty or sulh. The Arab concern was to facilitate the conquest with the least number of Arab casualties, but also preserving the economic infrastructure of the area. In cases where the Sindhi resistance was intense, the Arab response was equally intense. For example, a massacre lasting up to 3 days occurred at Derryl. 6,000 combatants were killed at Rawar. 6,000 to 26,000 were killed at Brahmanabad, 4,000 at Iskalanda, and 6,000 at Multan. All of these towns were captured by force and with considerable Arab casualties. A number of places were taken by treaty or sulh, and they had few Arab or Sindhi casualties. Armabil, Nirun, Sivistan, Budia, Bait, Savandi, and Aror. All the cases, whether a place was taken by force or treaty, the Arab concern with keeping the economy secure meant that they exempted the artisans, merchants, and agriculturalists from severity of punishment. The policy of granting Aman was applied throughout Sindh only after the massacre at Derryl. It seems that Muhammad bin Qasim's preferred mode of conquest was through Aman, and of the tribes and towns which are described in the Chachnama, about 65% to 63% seems to have been secured through Aman or Sulh. Qasim was even critiqued by the governor Al-Hajjaj for his broad application of Aman into acerbic letters. Where he praised him for his procedures except for the practice of giving Aman. However, both Muhammad bin Qasim and his cousin Al-Hajjaj were in agreement that once Aman had been given, that is, once it was binding, and even if the individual had obtained it fraudulently, for example, a Brahmin combatant received an ahad in writing for himself or his family and his large entourage on the basis of misrepresentation. And Muhammad decided not to revoke the Aman because, according to him, words are words and a contract is a contract. So the surety and consistency of Aman and Ahad were matters of considerable importance to the Arab. This binding nature of treaties and covenants stemmed from the pre-Islamic concept of jiwar and was enshrined in the Quran and was taken very seriously. This facilitated the conquest of Sindh, since if the Arab treaties could be trusted, then the local people would then have less interest in resisting the conquest, particularly when resistance would mean death. So this was the military policy. Then one also has to consider the religious policy of the Arabs in Sindh before examining again, revisiting conversions. Religious policy was a corollary to political submission. Thus, before a religious policy could have been implemented, first the individuals and the communities had to submit to the Arab suzerainty. It was only after the greater part of Sindh was conquered and Dahir defeated that the details of a religious policy were laid out. This was elaborated at Brahmanabad and Aror. It was a choice not between Islam and the sword, but between Islam and Jizya. The Arabs extended the concept of dealing with non-Muslims of Sindh, a concept that they had developed for the Zoroastrians, considering them a halal kitab, that is, people with a scripture, and giving them the status of a halal dhimma, that is, dhimmis, as protected subjects. Three main issues were connected to the status of the dhimma in Sindh. One, the payment of the poll tax, jizya. Two, construction of new and repair of old temples. 3. Application of special discriminatory regulations on certain groups of dhimmis. The solutions were sought by the Arabs by referring to precedents followed in other regions of the Muslim world, but they also developed certain procedures which were unique to Sindh. The Arabs generally left the administrative apparatus in the hands of local Sindhis, probably the leaders of dominant regional castes, who acted under the supervision of a small number of Arab officers. Once the locals were paying the jizya, that's the local non-Muslims, and had been given the status of being protected, the issue was about how much religious freedom they had. And this issue was resolved along with consultation with the governor Al-Hajjaj, where the general argument was accepted that as long as the locals submitted and paid the jizya, their religious beliefs and practices were to be of no concern to the Muslims. The governor Al-Hajjaj was more interested in a steady and secure cash flow than in conversion. With this permission from the governor, Muhammad Qasim interpreted the letter comprehensively, and not only did he give the dhimmis permission to worship their own deities, rebuild their temples, but he also specified that the status of dhimmi guaranteed them the right to patronize religious mendicants, observe their own religious festivals and rituals, and even deduct a contribution to the priests of 3% from the principal of the poll tax. The religious mendicants, and in this case referring to Buddhists, were also given the sanction of soliciting contributions from the public by going from house to house with a copper bowl. In addition, the Arabs continued to follow certain discriminatory measures which had been applied by the previous states, pre-Islamic states, to the two important Sindhi castes of the Jats, which is in Arabic Zut and in Persian Jata, and the Lohanas, which were these Sindhi castes and who were rebellious in nature, the Jats and Lohanas, and therefore certain obligations and restrictions had been imposed upon them previously, and certain social markers, for example, they could leave their homes only when accompanied by a dog, were required to wear certain distinguishing items like black mantles. They were forbidden other garments like soft garments, hats and shoes, and they had to perform certain services like supply guides and road guards. If they did not follow these rules, they were liable to be punished with the punishment ranging from imposition of simple fines to immolation. So the Sindhi informants told the Arabs that these penalties had been built due to the savage and rebellious nature of the castes. And Muhammad is said to have ratified all these restrictions and also added a further requirement that they provide hospitality to travelers for a day. Thus, Muslim institutions served to legitimize and continue the caste system in Arab Sindh. In summary, one can say that the Arab policies were primarily oriented towards submission of the indigenous tribes to Arab rule and not necessarily towards the conversion of non-Muslims to Islam. There were few very apparent attempts by Muslims to proselytize, and this happened only after Umar II. And this happened towards the end of the Arab period under the Ismailis. In the 10th century, the Arabs showed little inclination to interfere with the two non-Muslim religions of Sindh as long as they did not rebel and kept on paying the tax to the government. In addition, they paid heed to the traditional Hindu caste customs and put additional riders to Dhimma status of certain caste groups. However, the Dhimmis were still seen as second-class citizens, perceived by Muslims to be following inferior religions, and though they were left free within limits to worship as they wished, the Muslims were equally free to condemn their worship. For example, in the construction of the Arab period mosque at Derryl, Shaivite lingas were incorporated into the bottom steps of all three portals, which was a definite indication of their contempt for Shaivism. Hindus and Buddhists were discriminated against, but not for the purposes of conversion. And regardless of what was Arab policy, many non-Muslims could have perceived conversion as a means of escaping that initial violence of the early conquest, particularly the combatants who could receive the aman in the case of conversion. For example, in the final battle between the Arabs and Raja Dahir of Aror, there is a mention of conversion of a group of soldiers. However, generally speaking, the policy of conquest and settlement focused on the submission of the Sindhis and not conversion. Thus, largely the simple model of coerced conversion cannot be adopted for Sindh. So, conversion cannot be said to have taken place primarily because of pressures of a militant conversionist Islam, nor can it be said to have taken place due to attractions of the principle of equality in Islam, because we have seen that they continued with caste customs, and nor is there evidence that there was very active proselytization, preaching of Islam so that people would convert. Therefore, one has to look for these reasons for conversion in more subtle factors, which will be our next lecture.